Welcome back. It is the 15th anniversary of Lehman crisis to the day, and it is the 10th anniversary, so to speak, of the taper tantrum, which happened in global financial markets, especially EMs, from May 2013 to August 2013. So, looking back at both these events, our two experts, Mridul Saggar, former executive director at RBI, and now professor at IIM Kozhikode, Sajjid Chinoy, chief economist at JP Morgan. Sajjid, Mridul, thank you very much for waiting. Mridul, now to get to the Lehman crisis, and as you saw it from the Reserve Bank, can you give us the blow-by-blow account and what went through your minds at that time in RBI? Was there a fear of imminent collapse?
On the Lehman?
Yes.
Yes. On the Lehman, everyone was clear that this crisis is becoming bigger and bigger, and spillovers will be there. I think it's a mistake to blame everything on Lehman being not bailed out during the crisis. I think Lehman didn't have enough collateral, and with the classic Walter Begert rule, it was difficult to bail out Lehman. But Lehman alone did not cause this crisis because essentially, if you see the spreads between the long-term banking rates and the overnight rates, they sort of spiked not on September 15th, but on September 19th, when the US Treasury announced that it will be putting in US dollars 700 billion for bank bailouts. That's what it will go to Congress for the bailout. So I think people overrate Lehman as the point. So important point here is the lesson is that the bailout strategies and the bail-ins which came later are important. We should have a clear framework for that.
Okay. Sajjid, to come to you, do you think India overreacted to the Lehman crisis, which was perhaps more a North American North Atlantic crisis, as Rakesh Mohan calls it, more of America and Europe. And we need not have gone too loose, both with fiscal and monetary policy at that time.
Well, Lata, like the pandemic, there was so much uncertainty that I don't blame policymakers at the time for saying we need some more insurance here on the growth front, because we just didn't know how acute the linkages would be, both on the financial side and the trade side. Were we entering some kind of global recession? There was too much uncertainty. Now, hindsight is 2020, but with hindsight, perhaps what needed to be done is, even if the initial stimulus was large, both for fiscal and monetary, that once it became clear 3 quarters later that India had been relatively unscathed, that growth was rebounding, the financial system was very sound, that at that point, perhaps the stimulus that had been injected could have been withdrawn sooner. Because what happened was the private sector rebounded rapidly in 2011, right? 2009, 10, and 11. But because there was all the stimulus still in the system, and it was being withdrawn very, very slowly, it set up some of these vulnerabilities that you alluded to earlier: the higher fiscal, the higher current account deficit, the real exchange rate appreciated, and that set us up for some of the trouble around the taper tantrum. So, with hindsight, it was not so much that the stimulus was too large, it was withdrawn too slowly in the subsequent years when it became clear that the impact from Lehman was quite minimal.
Mridul, you agree?
Agree on this, absolutely, with Sajjid on this. And the lesson here is that we need to be vigilant all the times. For instance, in the very present context, if your credit growth is hitting 20%, it's time you sort of react to it. The counter-cyclical buffers which the bank are supposed to build in good times are still not in place. So this is an opportune moment, and one would watch for the October policy if it does that.
Okay. That's important. Mridul, actually, then to come to the present day, Sajjid writes in his column that there is a danger that the fiscal support given in US and Europe during COVID may overstay, because in Lehman, monetary policy did all the heavy lifting. Now is fiscal threatening to go overboard? After all, the US rates at 4.3, the 10-year yields, are telling us that they are worrying about a large deficit in the next 2-3 years, the Fitch report. Mridul.
Sorry. Yeah. So I'm not too concerned on that at the moment, but I have already voiced this earlier in a newspaper article that actually we need to have a more stronger fiscal consolidation at this juncture. On the monetary side, the problem is that the global growth slowdown is really coming through. And so that is sort of putting some hassle. But again, the dithering on this thing could be costly because inflation is coming back. And one has to be watchful, not just in India. I mean, you look at any emerging market or the West, last 2 months inflation data is a tick upward and commodity prices have started increasing. So we have to be cautious of these sort of things.
Okay. So, Sajjid, what's your takeaway? Do you think that we are in danger of the fisc doing too much in this particular instance? I mean, more particularly in the US. And it's a strange thing. India will have to react if US 10-year rates are at 4.3. Even if we controlled our inflation better, as the latest number indicates, we really don't have elbow room. We have to keep our rates high.
You know, what's been mind-boggling is this lack of coherence between fiscal and monetary policy in advanced economies for the last 15 years. With the 15th anniversary of that incoherence, right? I spoke about the fact that, fiscal and monetary were nullifying each other after Lehman. I completely agree with Mridul, that you have to build counter-cyclical buffers, that fiscal has to correct in the good times. My only concern was that it overcorrected between 2010 and 2017, where the structural deficits were tightened by 5 to 10 percentage points of GDP. Now the opposite has happened. Look at what's happened in the US in the last 18 months. The Fed is scrambling to contain inflation. They've raised rates by 500 basis points in a year. And guess what fiscal policy did this year in the US? It expanded by 3 percentage points of GDP, right? So fiscal clearly was not helping the Fed's cause and clearly was not helping inflation's cause. So, hopefully, wiser counsel will prevail. And going forward in advanced economies, both fiscal and monetary will reinforce each other.
Okay, actually, out of time, but I want 10 seconds from both of you on only one question. More generally, Mridul, do you think that EMs have been more responsible both during Lehman and during the taper tantrum response?
Yes,
and COVID.
They are more responsible. Unequivocally, yes. But Lata, I also won't get scared on some things, especially the digital space.
Okay.
And that's where the G20, which has strived for an agreement, crypto regulation is on card, and IMF FSB synthesis paper has been taken, pushing aside the BIS view on one side. And that could be still a source of the next financial crisis, is my worry. Okay. So what would EM do doesn't really matter.
Last thoughts, Sajjid, just 10 seconds.
Yeah, Lata, we've spoken on all the ills around the economy. Let's give ourselves some credit. We saw the most aggressive monetary tightening in the world in 40 years last year, and India was relatively unscathed. Because as we wrote in our piece this morning, we drew the right lessons from the taper tantrum. Buffers matter. Today, our reserves are almost twice gross financing requirements. Real exchange rates are positive. We have an inflation targeting framework. Inflation is half the level it was in 2011 and 12 for the 6 years before the pandemic. The real exchange rate is not misaligned. So we've learned the right lessons, which is why India was able to fortify itself over the last 12 months in that amidst the global turmoil.
Got that. Out of time, but yes, sir, a pat on the back for EMs, especially for India. But very important, Mridul Saggar pointing out that the synthesis paper coming from the IMF on cryptocurrency regulation could perhaps overlook the red flags raised by the BIS. And are we in the throes of another crisis, this time perpetrated by fintechs and cryptos? Well, we will have to wait and see whether we have learned all our lessons. Thank you very much, Mridul Saggar and Sajjid Chinoy, for joining me and analyzing two big events for financial markets, the global financial crisis of 2008 and the taper tantrum of 2013.